You've done it. You've finally landed on the last page of your manuscript. You've written that final sentence and you have typed that final period. You are done with your book. But now you're suddenly hit with a wave of anxiety. Does this ending suck? Does it get across the message that I intended? In this video, I'm going to walk through some framework to help you determine the effectiveness of your ending. And to do that, I'm going to walk through a series of questions to ask yourself about your ending. They're going to put you in the reader's shoes to help you visualize and understand their experience of the ending and therefore determine if it is what you were going for or not. A little trick here is that if you answer no to any of the questions I'm going to go through, then maybe you should rethink your ending and it could be improved in some way. If you are anywhere along the book writing journey, I recommend subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. Every week, I either talk about how to strengthen your manuscript with videos like this one, or I talk about the book publishing industry and provide insight into how to go about the publishing process, and I'd love to have you around. I also have a free worksheet in the description below. It's called my story self-assessment. It is a checklist that's designed to help you determine where your draft is really strong and where there are areas of weakness or improvement. I do have at least one question in there about your book's ending, so definitely go down and grab that in the description. It's also going to sign you up for my newsletter that is launching soon with exclusive tips and resources. So let's dive into the first way to tell if your book ending sucks, and that's to ask yourself, has the main plot conflict been resolved? This is the most important consideration and factor to keep in mind when you are trying to determine if your ending is effective or not. After all, you hooked the reader into the story with this intriguing point of conflict or tension that they were eager to see how it played out. And after all, they stuck with you throughout the entire middle portion of the story because they were invested in that conflict or point of tension. So now that they have reached the ending, they're going to be craving some kind of resolution. Now remember, that resolution does not mean that your story has to have what we call a happy ending. That is not the case at all. There are plenty of instances where a sad or even tragic ending also provides a sense of closure and resolution. The example I'm going to use throughout the video today is the movie Titanic, one of my favorites. I know it's a little sappy, but I do love it. I'm a little bit obsessed with Titanic history overall. That's a little fun fact about me. But the ending of that movie is a good example of a resolved ending that is not necessarily a happy one. We see the image of the elderly Rose and realize that she has lived a very full life, even though Jack, her lover on the Titanic, has died. So it is bittersweet in that way. The ending is still, however, resolved because we saw the full experience of their relationship and their experience on the boat, which was the main plot conflict that we were following from the beginning of the story. This ending would not work well if, for instance, we never see how their relationship plays out, or we never understand what happens whenever the ship starts to sink. Now, in some cases, it is possible to have an ambiguous ending that still feels resolved. In this case, it's important that the reader at least understands what the different possible outcomes are for the characters in order to provide that type of resolution that they are seeking. So they might not know for sure whether the characters went down X path or Y path, but at least they know it's one of those two situations, for instance. Let's spend some time talking about the next question to ask yourself to determine if your ending sucks. And that is, did I tie up all of the loose ends? Remember that character that you introduced way back in chapter 4, but then they never reappeared in the story? Or what about that subplot that you followed for a few chapters in the middle of the story and then kind of dropped off? By the end of the book, all of those loose ends should have some sense of closure. Make sure that your reader doesn't have any lingering questions about what happened with that character, what happened with that subplot, because that's going to be distracting at the end of your book. Keep in mind that these loose ends do not necessarily need to be tied up right in the final scene or in the final pages of your manuscript. They can be tied up at any point throughout the story. You just want to make sure that by the ending, you have addressed all of those plot threads that were introduced earlier on. In the process of revisiting these loose ends, you might realize that maybe that subplot or that secondary character actually isn't necessary at all, and the earlier scene that introduced this point might actually be better served if it was cut from the manuscript. I have a whole other video on scenes to cut from your book, so I recommend checking that out if you are interested in potentially trimming the manuscript down. The next way to determine if your novel ending sucks is to ask yourself, has the protagonist undergone some kind of transformation? Think about where your protagonist or protagonists were at the start of the story. What was their age? Where were they physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually? What was their state of life? What were their dreams and aspirations? And now, as you're thinking about the book's ending, where are they? What has changed in their life for better or potentially for worse? In some cases, it is possible that your character actually has ended up right where they began, and that is completely okay for an ending. However, you still want to ensure that they have taken some kind of journey that brought them back to that place. What I'm speaking about here is ensuring that your ending completes your character's arc from point A to point B. And in your ending, I recommend illustrating that transformation by giving us an image of what that point B looks like for your main character or characters. Think about the final shots of the Titanic movie. We see the image of the elderly Rose passing away in her sleep and then entering the afterlife where she is reunited with all of the passengers and Jack, who died on the Titanic. This is a great way of completing her character journey and showing where she is at that final end of her character arc. The next question to ask yourself to determine your ending effectiveness is the final sentiment appropriate? Take a look at your final paragraph and your final sentence specifically. What is the tone? What feeling or emotion is that final sentence meant to evoke in the reader? It could be, for example, melancholy or optimism or distress even. Now that you've determined what that feeling is, try to decipher if that feeling is appropriate for the genre and for your specific story. Is this sentiment in line with the overarching message and the takeaway that you are going for with your story? For instance, ending with a distressed sentiment might actually work perfectly well for the thriller genre, where you're kind of keeping the reader on edge and they have this feeling that maybe the threat that you saw in the story is going to return. However, a distressed sentiment is likely not going to be appropriate for a rom-com. It's not going to be what the reader expects. It's not going to provide them that sense of resolution that they are seeking. So keeping with the Titanic example, the ending scene of Rose reuniting with Jack in the afterlife is appropriate for the romance/drama genre. And it evokes that feeling of tenderness and even joy. Ultimately, after the reader finishes that final sentence and puts the book down, you want to make sure they feel something and that it is the right sentiment. Otherwise, it's possible that they could feel like the book was unsatisfying or that the ending really let them down and kind of ruined the rest of the story for them, which is absolutely what you want to avoid. The last question to ask yourself to determine if your book ending sucks is, did I avoid clichés? Now, I'm guessing you probably didn't end your book with "and they lived happily ever after," because that's a very well-known cliche. But there are a few other cliche type endings that you might want to reconsider, such as having a proposal or a marriage in the final scene. This happens especially in romance, and sometimes it can work perfectly well, but keep in mind that it is not always necessary for the lovers in the story to get engaged or have a marriage in order to provide that sense of resolution for the reader. So sometimes it can just feel a bit overdramatic. In the thriller genre, maybe resurrecting the villain could end up being a bit of a cliche, where we see that they have now re-emerged from the dead or something like that and are on the prowl to potentially terrorize the characters again. Again, it can work in some situations, but just something to be aware of. A pregnancy announcement or a birth is another common ending trope, so just make sure that the plot actually warrants and asks for that development at the ending, and try to avoid falling into these tropes or cliches just because you feel like you need something like that to happen at the ending. Oftentimes, a more subtle ending is just as, if not more, effective than one of these big plot developments right at the end. Keep in mind that if the ending feels overdone or too predictable, then you might end up with the reader rolling their eyes at the ending, which is definitely not the reaction you're going for. As I said, cliches are not totally off limits by any means. We see movies all the time with tons of cliches in them. You just want to make sure that you don't lean on them too much and that you are offering your own spin on them. That way they will feel fresh and creative rather than tired and overused. I have a whole other video on common plot cliches in fiction, so go ahead and check that out if you're worried about falling into any of these cliches. I hope this video helps you determine if your ending is effective or if it could use some work to ensure that it provides that sense of resolution for the reader. Remember that it can be immensely helpful to work with a beta reader or critique partner or even a professional editor to get that external and objective set of eyes on your manuscript draft and ask them up front how the ending made them feel and if it felt appropriate for the rest of the story and provided a nice rounded conclusion or not. This stuff can be really hard to see in your own work. Let me know in the comments what challenges you faced with trying to end your book. I'd love to hear any obstacles that you have been grappling with. I also have a video on the best ways to open your novel, so definitely check that out if you are concerned about both the ending and the beginning. And as I mentioned, please hit that like button if you found this video helpful and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It helps me know that I'm bringing you useful and interesting content and allows me to continue growing this wonderful community. Make sure you grab that free story self-assessment in my description below. It's going to help you dive into your draft with fresh eyes and a constructive mindset, so it can definitely be helpful in the revision process. Thank you so much for watching and happy writing.